Hello, welcome to Week 9 Sociology of Crime. My name is William Wood. This week we're looking at Marxist criminology and some contemporary critical perspectives. We'll have 3 shorter lectures this week. Starting with a primer on Marx, we're really interested in the origins of the critical perspective as well as his notion of class conflict, its relationship to capitalism. Second lecture, we'll look at early conflict criminology beginning in the early 20th century until about the 1950s. A third shorter lecture will look at contemporary critical perspectives, really from the 1960s on to present day. So let's go ahead and get started. In the weekly course content folder for week 9, you'll find a brief snippet of a documentary from a doco called Marx and Marxism. I think it does a pretty good job of setting forth Marx's basic argument or concept of class struggle or class consciousness. It would be useful for you to watch prior to the lecture. I think it will fill in some background for what we're going to look at in the next few slides. Marx argued a doctrine of materialism. What we mean by this term isn't that people are materialistic, but that the way that society meets its members' needs through the distribution of goods and services in turn determines many of the other aspects of that society. Its philosophy, its art, its culture, how its families are shaped, what its education system looks like. Without meeting these basic needs, Marx argues, there can be no society. So food, shelter, protection, all of these things are really the foundational things that in turn create a society. This is what he means by this notion of materialism. So according to Marx, societies can be best understood then by attention to the manner by which they produce and distribute resources necessary for living: food, shelter, safety, etc. He makes an argument that materialism matters not only because it tells us or reflects something about the particular society, but that materialism itself is a type of driving force throughout history. This is a concept he calls historical materialism. For Marx, the organization of this type of material distribution of goods and services had changed throughout history in what he called successive modes of production. Feudalism here is an example of an older mode of production, capitalism a modern mode. So historical materialism stood in contrast to religious and metaphysical explanations, views of history. If you think back 200 or 300 years ago, most of the explanations of history tended to be either on the metaphysical level, which we'll mention briefly, or still on the religious level, right? Some cosmology or God's hand shaping destiny, things like this. Marx made the argument that neither of these were true. In fact, we could look much more scientifically at material forces that drove historical transformations. He called this the dialectical movement of history. It wasn't his idea, however. He took it from an earlier German historian named Georg Hegel. In fact, Marx was associated with a group called the Young Hegelians. During his day, Hegel was the most influential philosopher, certainly in Germany, perhaps all of Europe. Hegel made the argument that there is a movement through history. There's actually a beginning to history. There's an end history, right? And this history would achieve what he called an absolute unity or an absolute knowledge that both answered as well as transcended the dualism contained in earlier religious and philosophical systems. It's not that important that you understand the intricacies of Hegel's argument. It is important, however, that you get the basic gist that for Hegel, there's a movement of history through time. So this is referred to as the dialectic because there are opposing forces that come together again and again. Over time, they create new types of societies. These new types of societies have new truths or new knowledge, so on. The movement for this, Hegel coined a term that you're probably familiar with, zeitgeist, right? Spirit of the time. Achievement of unity proceeded for Hegel through a series of contradictions, negations, the result of which led to new historical conditions. So different parts of history, he argued, exhibited different truths. They're in fact only partially true of the dialectical unfolding of the absolute. This absolute, he argued, can only occur in some sense at the individual level, but not without the necessary unfolding of dialectical truths on a collective level. History, he argued, moves through time. So a schematic looks something like this. You have an idea and you have its opposite. You have slavery and you have freedom, right? We can find many ideas and their opposites throughout history. And at some point they come into contradiction, he says, and that contradiction results in some type of synthesis. A new idea emerges out of this. Out of this emerges yet another antithesis, an opposing idea. And this goes on and on and on throughout history, but not in a haphazard way, he argues. In fact, there's a larger logic at play for Hegel. Marx agreed with Hegel's notion of something, a spirit moving through time. But for Hegel, the spirit was immaterial. It was in the world of ideas, the world of consciousness. For Marx, it was quite the opposite. He inverts Hegel's dialectic, and he says that Hegel's right to argue that there's a larger force or forces at play in history, but it's not ideas for Marx that shape or move history. It's rather the material. This is why his materialism is often referred to as historical or dialectical materialism. Marx is influenced by Hegel's idea that history is dialectical. It moves through opposing forces again and again. But it's not these forces, these immaterial spirits, consciousness, so on, that move history, but rather material forces. He makes this argument because material forces, he says, are always limited. They always tend to occur or center around conflict between social classes. So we can see an overview of this. I realize the writing is a little small. When we look at how Marx, in some sense, adopts Hegel's notion of the thesis and antithesis into a new synthesis, and he thinks of them not as spirits, but rather as particular modes of production that move through time. So here we have, during the Middle Ages of feudalism, right, gave rise to cities, which became the birthplace of a class opposed to the aristocracy. Here Marx is talking about the rise of burghers, or eventually the bourgeoisie, which occurs as land becomes increasingly useful to the wealthy, not for the ability to have peasants live on it and produce surplus, but rather for its commodity goods, wheat, wool, and so on. The peasants are moved off, they're moved into cities. Land becomes itself increasingly a commodity, creating a class of increasingly rich town dwellers, bourgeoisie. In many ways, these town dwellers, their interests, even though they're wealthy, are not aligned with the old landed aristocracy. So you have two parts of the thesis and the antithesis conflict with each other, creating a synthesis, which is capitalism. Okay? So the larger thing that I want you to take from this, it's really beyond the scope of this class to do an entire lecture or course on the history of Marxist thought. What I want you to take away is that for Marx, there's always a period in history where there are two or more, but generally two types of classes opposed to each other. And this opposition always comes down to the scarcity of material goods. So this leads to Marx and Engels' famous argument in the Communist Manifesto. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, they argue, but their social being that determines their consciousness. What they mean by this is that our own personal relationship to the material distribution and production of goods and services determines in many ways the types of philosophies, the types of social being, what we believe in terms of ethics, law. This is all shaped, they argue, by our social being. In many ways, they're somewhat radically inverting a lot of the previous philosophical or speculative philosophy that people we talked about last week, like Wilhelm Wundt, who argued in some sense the mind is separate from the body. People like Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, Marx would say. No, you are in some sense who your social being is, where you exist in those forces and relations of production. So in any society, Marx argued, there exists an economic organization of these forces and relations of production. By forces, Marx meant things necessary for material production. Well, forces of production are things like technology, energy, material resources required to make production work. The stuff of production. By relations, Marx meant the means by which this production takes place. What are the social relations? How do people work? Under what conditions do they work? Do they work for wages? Do they work for their lives? Do they work under slavery? Do they work under capitalism? In the case of capitalism, Marx divided the relations of production into profit-oriented capitalists, people who own factories and other productive enterprises, and the proletariat, people who provide labor necessary to operate factories, other productive enterprises. But Marx argued that conflict between these two was inevitable in a system of capitalist production. The reason for this is fairly straightforward. People who live on their wages have a vested self-interest in getting as much as they can from those wages. Right? So workers want more wages. Profit, argued Marx, and this wasn't his finding alone, in fact he looked back to earlier economists such as David Ricardo, profit comes from capitalist ownership of the relations of production where they are able, in a sense, to pay less than the market value of wages to workers. So if we can quantify the daily market value of a wage, argues Marx, we might see that a worker works a value of 8 hours. He's paid, however, Marx argues, only 6. He can be paid 6 because he has no other choice. The owner of the factory can pay him as little as the market allows for, below the fair wage value. In effect, then, the owner is able to usurp the surplus value of those wages, and this, argues Marx, is the source of profit. This is often different than what we think of when we think of capitalism, the source of profit, buy low, sell high. That's actually called arbitrage. Arbitrage has long been used prior to the advent of capitalism. You buy a product, or merchants would travel far distances and buy products for cheap, travel, sell them for high. That's not capitalism proper, argues Marx. Capitalism proper is a system by which profit is generated from the owners or the bourgeoisie usurping the surplus value of labor. That, according to Marx, is the source of profit, capitalist modes of production. So all societies are comprised of social institutions, right? We're studying sociology. We've looked at a variety of social institutions. We think of functionalism, for example. We can look at how functionalism studies politics, families, religion, education, so on. For Marx, all societies were comprised of these institutions. We can think of these as the major spheres of social life. But a primary difference for Marx was that he considered economic institutions to be the most dominant and defining of a society. So he considered the economy to be the infrastructure in which all other social institutions, which he called the superstructure, were based. So the institutions of modern societies, he argued, tend to reinforce capitalist domination. So here we have the infrastructure, or the base on which the technological and social processes of economic production. Examples of modes of production present and past that he gave: slavery, feudalism, which we've already looked at, mercantilism, and then contemporary capitalism. There are more than this. For those of you that are interested, he sets these forth in volume 1 and 2 of Capital. What's more important for us here is Marx's argument that industrial capitalism contains two major social classes, two major classes that are inherently at conflict with each other. Right, this inherent conflict comes from the working class or the proletariat seeking to gain as much as it can from its wages in order to live, and owners or the bourgeoisie seeking to pay as little wages as possible that the market will bear in order to usurp as much surplus value of labor as possible. So industrial capitalism contains two major social classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, reflecting the two basic positions in this mode of production. The proletariat, as we mentioned, those who sell their labor power for a wage, and the bourgeoisie, those who make their living from the surplus value. So this class conflict then, and I've mentioned this in lecture 1, but I really want to drive it home again. When we talk about conflict theory, we don't mean that people are in conflict interpersonally. We mean their social relations and their place in social relations bring them into inherent conflict on group levels, on levels of things like social class, or as we'll see next week in terms of gender, race or ethnicity, and so on. Antagonism between entire classes for Marx over the distribution of wealth and power is inevitable, as we mentioned, for two reasons: opposite goals, but also another reason that Marx argued, class consciousness, or the workers' recognition of their unity as a class in opposition to capitalists. Class consciousness, argued Marx, and we can see various levels of this or examples of this throughout history. Unions, for example, are a good representation of class consciousness, labor movements, so on. These arise, Marx argued, in response to the tendency of capitalism to create a condition called alienation. Alienation, he defined as the experience of isolation resulting from powerlessness. There are several types of alienation, or several facets of alienation, he argued. It's a sense of dislocation or disconnection from the act of working itself. When you work simply for a wage, the value, the use value of labor, the relationship between you and your work fundamentally changes. Alienation from the products of work. We live in societies increasingly where the things that we make with our hands, with our minds, are fundamentally disconnected from the lives that we live. Right? Factories we work in that sell goods that we can never afford. Think of tradies working, building houses, neighborhoods they can hardly afford to live in, so on and so forth. Alienation from other workers. Instead of having a recognition of our shared consciousness, Marx argues, you and I become in competition over the scarcity of resources. There's one job and there's two workers. It's in the capitalist's best interest, he says, for those workers to be alienated from each other. An alienation from human potential. He calls capitalism the most productive economic mode that's ever existed in the history of the world. And yet we find in this productivity that instead of having less and less time to work, less and less time for leisure, we have less and less time devoted to anything but work. It isn't because there's more work to be done, he argues. It's because a very small number of people usurp a huge amount of the surplus profits or the surplus labor value for themselves. So the system requires us to be increasingly involved in wage earning when the productivity of capitalism were distributed equally would allow for a significant amount of leisure time, pursuits towards other aspects of human potential, art, education, relationships, and so on. So Marx, in many ways, is the origin of this conflict perspective. Out of the early classical sociological thinkers, he was certainly the most conflict-oriented. He viewed society as very much entrenched, industrial society is very much entrenched in conflict. It wouldn't resolve itself without some type of larger revolution, some type of larger transformation. So he's a prolific writer in this sense. The influence of his work is impossible to overestimate. His influence, obviously, in places like the rise of communism in Russia and later China, the influence of thinking of many countries throughout the world. Obviously, some of you would know quite controversial in this sense. But we're not really looking at Marxism as an ideology here. We're looking more at the contribution that Marx makes sociologically in our ability to analyze societies on the basis of these structural contradictions or these structural conflicts. And for this, I think Marx is far less argumentative than some of his prophecies or predictions. Right? When you have politicians like Bill Clinton telling us it's the economy, stupid, in many ways this is not dissimilar from what Marx was telling us 150 years ago. So he's a prolific writer. However, his influence on crime and criminology is far less related to his own works or his works with Frederick Engels than it is to later sociologists or criminologists that pick up on a lot of his focus on these internal contradictions, particularly class struggle and class consciousness. So left to later writers to attempt to apply his numerous writings and theories to the question of crime in modern capitalist societies. So that's where we'll go ahead and end the first lecture. We'll pick up with the following lecture beginning on some of these earlier writers that picked up on his or employed his notion of this internal or inherent conflict between social classes and modern capitalist societies.